Welcome to Lumina, the House of Education. This podcast exists to make a difference. Here, real stories from classrooms, schools, and education systems are brought together to reshape what education is meant to be in modern times. We talk about leadership, responsibility, values, and the human side of learning. This is a space for education leaders who are done reacting and ready to lead. Let's begin.
Welcome back. If you're trying to get a quick handle on why the American education system feels like it's just constantly in conflict, pulled in every direction, you've definitely come to the right place. Today we're launching into an analysis that pulls together a whole stack of recent research, and it really maps out two massive interconnected challenges that schools are facing right now.
That's right. Our focus for this review is some really critical material from the RAND Corporation. They've published some very influential work lately looking at two specific crises. First, this intense politicization of school governance. And second, the catastrophic level of job-related stress that's threatening the entire teacher workforce.
And that connection, right, the connection between those two things is the whole mission here. We're not just looking at isolated problems like low pay or COVID logistics. We're trying to explore how these external political pressures have fundamentally changed how decisions get made in schools. That's the macro level. And then how that high-stress, low-trust environment up at the top translates directly into fatigue and these massive retention issues for the people actually in the classroom, the micro level.
It's a complete systems challenge. Our goal is to really distill the key findings from these RAND studies to help us all grasp why an everyday school decision now feels so heavy, loaded with all this symbolic and political weight, and what that stress is ultimately costing the whole system.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we should start at the top with governance. The source material kind of reminds us that there was a time, maybe a decade ago, when local school decisions felt, well, mostly educational. Curriculum, staffing, building maintenance. The practical stuff.
That era is just gone. RAND's research is pretty clear that political polarization, it didn't stop at the state or federal level. It moved directly, and I'd say aggressively, into local school governance. So school boards are no longer just these, bureaucratic oversight bodies. They've become high-stakes political arenas.
Arenas, that's a strong word. And the mechanism for that is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all driven by technology and visibility. It's not a quiet meeting in a gym anymore. Now they're live streamed, clips get edited and passed around online. And suddenly, every vote is interpreted as a statement.
Exactly. And what's really profound is how the actual purpose of making a decision changes when you factor that in. What used to be based on, say, internal judgment, yes, the superintendent's expertise, the administrators, is now immediately translated into public symbolism.
Okay, could you give us a concrete example of that? What's a policy decision that shows that shift from judgment to symbolism?
Absolutely. Think about the debates over something like curriculum transparency, or even mask mandates during the pandemic. In a judgment-based system, leadership asks, what's the best way to ensure health and safety? How do we minimize disruption? They look at data, consult experts, and they move forward. But once it becomes symbolic, the whole question changes. The decision isn't about public health or pedagogy anymore. It becomes a proxy battle in a larger culture war. It's about signaling allegiance to a political tribe.
And that's where the research gets really interesting, because that pressure completely changes the calculus for every single leader. The sources say they stop asking that straightforward, ideal question. Is this the right educational choice for our students?
They replace it. They replace it with questions driven by self-preservation and political avoidance. They start asking, how will this be weaponized against me? Who's going to be triggered? What kind of backlash is this going to generate online?
And the system pays a huge price for that kind of paralysis. When every single decision carries that much emotional and political weight. The research confirms that a deep fatigue sets in. And the sources are really clear. This isn't just individual fatigue, it's fatigue for the system itself.
Right. And the measurable output of that is just chronic hesitation, delay, a constant favoring of safer choices over better ones. So if a new math curriculum is way better educationally, but it has one little thing that could be attacked politically, leaders are just going to stall or water it down or stick with the older, less optimal choice.
So educational quality becomes a secondary concern. It's all about political survival. And this creates, just a deeply unstable environment to work in. The RAND research points out that schools are now often operating in low-trust environments by default. And we all know what happens when trust is broken. It is, and I'm quoting here, incredibly hard to rebuild.
Which forces a new kind of leadership. That's what the research calls it. This isn't about avoiding conflict anymore because the conflict is constant. Instead, the mandate shifts. It becomes about standing clearly and publicly for process, for shared values, for boundaries.
Wait, hold on. Isn't pleasing everyone, or at least representing all your constituents, isn't that the main job of a school board? How does RAND justify this shift away from that?
They justify it by just recognizing the new reality. If the environment is built around political opposition, where pleasing one side automatically enrages the other, you can't manage for consensus. It's impossible. So the research suggests leaders have to become the stabilizing force instead, the keeper of the process. It's less about consensus and more about consistency.
So if you're a superintendent, your job has changed from being like the chief educational officer to being a high-stakes cultural mediator. And your main goal is just holding the system steady when everything around it is pulling apart.
Yeah.
Because if you can't stabilize the system, none of the other work gets done.
Precisely. And that instability is the perfect transition to the second crisis we need to talk about, the human cost. Because while governance is stalled out, the front lines, the teachers, they're facing an existential threat.
Yeah, that really sets the stage for the threat to the teacher supply. I mean, teaching was already hard, but the 2020-2021 school year, that introduced a completely new level of stress. You're talking about teachers navigating new technology, balancing hybrid classes, all while the system above them was paralyzed.
The sources paint a pretty devastating picture. It's compounded personal and professional burdens. Just think about the logistics. 1 in 3 teachers reported they were also caring for their own kids while trying to teach. I mean, that's an impossible workload.
And the data on the impact is it's alarming. The 2021 State of the U.S. Teacher Survey shows this massive spike in teachers wanting to leave. Nearly 1 in 4 were considering quitting by the end of that school year.
1 in 4. And to put that in perspective, the pre-pandemic average was 1 in 6, and this rate was significantly higher than the national rate for all employed adults. So this isn't just general job dissatisfaction, this is a profession in crisis.
That is a staggering jump. Does the research break that down by demographics at all? Who is most likely to leave?
Yes, it does. And this part raises some really critical equity concerns. The findings show that Black or African American teachers were particularly likely to plan to leave, which is, a huge data point for districts trying to build a diverse workforce.
And beyond just the intent to leave, the day-to-day stress levels they were reporting were just off the charts, weren't they?
Critically high. A much higher proportion of teachers reported frequent job-related stress, symptoms of depression, much higher than the general adult population. The sources basically mapped the profession becoming a mental health crisis zone.
And when they dug into the root causes, what were the top 2 stressors that teachers kept pointing to?
They were direct consequences of the pandemic's operational chaos. The top 2 were the constant shifting mode of instruction remote to hybrid, back again, and of course, persistent health concerns about safety in their own school buildings.
Let's talk about the operational side for a second. The study found that technical problems while teaching remotely were a huge factor, like your Zoom crashing while you're juggling a live class, or spending hours fixing your mic instead of grading papers. It's more than an inconvenience, it's a total erosion of your energy.
Exactly. It chips away at their sense of professional efficacy. And the research has this really interesting category, the likely pandemic leavers. These are teachers who were stable before the pandemic, unlikely to quit, but who said they were now very likely to leave.
Why is that distinction so important? Why focus on those likely leavers?
Because they're the canary in the coal mine. The sources found that the stressful conditions these likely leavers were reporting, the technical problems, the unstable instruction modes, were almost identical to the conditions reported by teachers who had already resigned.
So the implication is crystal clear. Without some kind of major intervention, these likely leavers are they're the next wave of resignations. The source material is basically a giant flashing warning sign. Fix the working conditions now or get ready for an exodus.
Which brings it all back to that system's challenge. The leaders are stressed by politicization, but they have a clear mandate. They have to find ways to retain these frontline workers.
So what does this all mean for the people actually running the system? The research doesn't just identify the problems, it also offers concrete recommendations. So let's look at how RAND breaks down those solutions.
Yeah, we can structure them by who's responsible. So what schools and districts can do, what state leaders can do. Let's start at the local level with safety and focus, since those were the top stressors.
Right, which just means giving teachers a consistent, safe environment so they can actually do their jobs.
Precisely. Schools have to move beyond just, token gestures and actually implement the recommended COVID mitigation measures. This is pragmatic stuff, making sure windows work, getting air purifiers, upgrading ventilation. And critically, the sources suggest hiring additional staff just to enforce compliance, so that burden isn't on the teacher.
And also facilitating student vaccinations when they're available. That's just smart logistical support. Okay, what about supporting the emotional health of people who've been in crisis mode for years now?
That falls under the leader's mandate for mental health and strategic data collection. Districts should be designing and implementing real mental health and wellness supports, and they can use the American Rescue Plan funds that were allocated for exactly this kind of thing.
And that data point is key to making sure those investments actually work, right?
Absolutely. They have to move beyond anecdotes and collect actual data on working conditions, then link that to well-being and attrition. The research is explicit that leaders have to recognize that teachers from different backgrounds, especially teachers of color, might have very different stressors. A generic wellness webinar isn't going to cut it.
Okay, moving up the chain. What can state leaders do to help with those external stressors, like the childcare burden we talked about?
State leaders have to make childcare access a priority for teachers. The big recommendation is to include teachers in the definition of essential worker for things like the American Rescue Plan's childcare assistance. Relieving that huge personal stress is a really high-yield retention strategy.
And finally, back down to the district level and the technology piece, we established that technical chaos was a huge driver of burnout.
Yes. So district leaders have to professionalize the tech environment. That means clear, collaborative policies for remote teaching, no more making it up as you go, and adopting real standards for equipment, standardized laptops, functional cameras, good microphones, and then the training to use it all. That's non-negotiable. It minimizes the chaos that directly causes stress.
This has been a really compelling review. We've sort of charted this core tension, haven't we? The whole system is being paralyzed by politicization at the top, forcing leaders into this symbolic conflict management role, while at the same time it's just hemorrhaging talent at the foundational level because of burnout.
Right. And if we connect this all back to where we started, that conclusion on trust is really the dominant theme. If school systems are, by default, operating in these low-trust environments, where every single move is politicized, it raises a really important question for you to think about. Can any list of tactical recommendations, standardizing laptops or getting better air purifiers, can any of that truly succeed if the leaders can't first fulfill that mandate of holding the system steady, if they can't stand clearly for process and values and boundaries? Because if that foundation is always shifting, then that whole list of fixes, it's just temporary relief. That's something to mull over.
Education doesn't change through slogans. It changes when leaders are willing to look again at what really matters. If this episode raised a question worth sitting with, then it did its job. This is Lumina, the House of Education. We'll continue the conversation tomorrow.